Function calling is the key to unlocking the true power of large language models, freeing LLMs to interact with the outside world through the use of tools. Without tools, LLMs are confined to their digital cages. Function calling allows them to reliably access tools so that they can use real-time data, carry out tasks outside of their internal environment, and interact with other applications. In this video, we're going to cover the fundamentals of function calling, what it is and how it works, and then we're going to walk through an easy-to-follow step-by-step process for implementing function calling into LLM applications. Okay, I think the best way to get a good intuitive understanding of function calling is to play around with it in the OpenAI playground so that you can actually visualize how it works. Go to platform.openai.com, sign up or log into your account. Once that's done, go to Dashboard and make sure you're on the chat screen in the playground. The playground is a good place to experiment with GPT before you start writing code. I'm going to switch my model here from 4.0 to 4.0 mini, which is the newest model. I don't need any system instruction right now. And what I'm going to do is just ask GPT a simple question. I'm going to ask, what is the current stock price of Microsoft? Click run. And here we can see that it's not able to provide me with an answer. It says I'm unable to provide real-time stock prices or current data. So GPT in its native form is completely confined to its internal environment. It doesn't have any access to information outside of this internal environment. It can't do anything in the outside world. The only information that it can utilize is either information that's in its training data, and the knowledge cutoff right now is October of 2023, or any information that I specifically provide in the prompt. But this is where function calling and tools come in. I'm going to direct your attention over to the right side here, add function. Let's click on this. And I'm just going to select one of these examples. Let's select get stock price. So to add a function for function calling, this is the format that the data needs to be in. It's a dictionary. It has the name of a function, the description of the function, the parameters of the function, which in this case is just the symbol. It's a string, the description, and what parameters are required. What's important to highlight is that this function does not exist right now. I would have to write it outside of GPT. But what function calling is doing is I'm telling GPT that I have this function available that could be used to help answer the user's query. So I'm going to save this. And now we notice under functions, we have get stock price data. Now I'm going to ask this exact same question again. What is the current stock price of Microsoft? Now, instead of telling me that it can't help me, it responds with a function call for get stock price. So we can see it has the name of the function here and also the parameter that the function takes. A symbol, in this case, Microsoft symbol is MSFT. Now, I never actually gave GPT the symbol. I just gave it the name. But it knows from its training data what the symbol of Microsoft is, and it knows from the function calling data that I gave it that it needs the symbol. So again, this function right now, get stock price data, doesn't exist. It's not that GPT can actually call or execute this function itself. We simply told it that this is a function we have available. And now based on the user query, it's saying, yes, we should use this function in order to get the information to answer this user's question. And it provided us with the data in the exact format that we can use as a parameter for this function. Now I can ask it another question. I can just ask, how are you doing today? And run. And we can see it replies just with a normal answer. It does not call the function because it knows that we don't need this function in order to answer the question. So I'm going to go back over here to add function. Again, I'm going to select the other example, which is get weather. And here again, we have the function calling information. So the name of the function, the description, the properties. So in this case, the parameters that this function would take include location, which is a string. It's the city and state. Also the unit, which is a string, which could be C for Celsius or F for Fahrenheit. And also a list of the required parameters. So in this case, only location is required. Now I'm going to save this. And I'm going to ask GPT, what is the weather like in Paris? And run. And we can see again, it provided a function call for getWeather, and it gave us the parameter that we need in order to call this function. So when we submit a question to GPT with function calling, it cannot call a function and just basically reply with its own internal knowledge, or it can call one or both or any combination of these functions as many times as it needs to in order to answer the question properly. So for example, I can ask, what is the sum of the current stock prices of Microsoft and NVIDIA minus the temperature in Berlin in Celsius, and select run. And we can see here that GPT has made 3 function calls in order to answer this question. It needs to have the stock price for Microsoft, it needs to have the stock price for NVIDIA, and also it needs the temperature in Berlin in order to answer this question. Now, to use function calling, what we would do if GPT calls tools is we would take the parameters that GPT provided us and the function name. We would then, outside of GPT, call those functions with those parameters and get that data. Then we would combine that data with the original question and send it back to GPT in order to get an answer. So function calling does 2 things. It selects if a tool needs to be called and which tools and how many need to be called. And if tools are called, it provides the data in exactly the format that those tools or functions need. But in order for this to work, we have to write these functions ourselves and write the code that will take GPT's function calls and actually call the functions. To see what the code looks like based on our setup here in the playground, we just go up to the top right here to the view code icon. And here we can see all the code for accessing the GPT API. So we're going to use Python. I'm going to copy this. Then I'm going to go to my VS Code and create a new file, main.py, and just paste this inside. I'll need to set up my development environment, so I'll create a new terminal and I will create and activate a virtual environment. And I'm going to pip install 2 libraries, OpenAI and Python.env to handle the API key. And I just made some changes up here to load the API key into the OpenAI client. So we should be good to go. So I'm just going to walk through some of this code and make a few changes. We've imported our libraries here, created an instance of the OpenAI client. And here is where we actually send a message to the OpenAI API with client.chat.completions.create. We specified our model 4.0 mini. And this other parameter here, messages, so this is a running record of the conversation. And every time we send a message to the model, we would add it, append it to this messages list with the role user, and then add our text content here. And then also every time we receive something back from the model, we would append that as well in a dictionary with role assistant. So I'm actually going to, we don't need the record of the conversation that we had in the playground. So I'm just going to delete all of this. And I'm actually going to move messages outside of this code because I'm going to create I'm going to wrap this into a function. We'll just call it GPT endpoint. And this is going to take the messages as a parameter. So we'll say messages equals messages, and then we'll just put the messages outside of the function here, initiating it as an empty list. So brand new conversation. And I'm also going to do the same thing with tools. So the tool parameters here is a list, and each item in the list is a dictionary, which contains the information on the functions that we want to be able to call. So we can see we had our get stock price function, we had our get weather function, but I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to take this out, and I can say tools equals tools. We can add tools as a parameter for this function, and then I'll just put these tools outside of the function here. Okay, so this looks a lot better. And then for this function here, GPT endpoint, for now, we're just going to return the response, and we'll look at that later. Okay, so these are our tools, and now we actually need to write the function so that when GPT calls these functions, we have something to execute. And I'm going to do this in a separate module. I created this module tools.py, and this is where we're going to store our two functions. So the first function we can look at here is the get stock price function. So it takes a symbol as a parameter. Now, basically, this is just a test function. Obviously, these aren't the real share prices, but the way that this works is if you put in one of these four symbols, it's going to return this price. If you put in any other symbol, it's going to return $1,000. This is just for testing purposes so we can see that it works. In practice, you would actually connect this to an API, so you would get real-time data. And we are going to do that a little bit later once we confirm that everything else is working. And then the second function here, get weather, takes location, and then the optional units. Again, this is just going to be a test function. If the units are in Celsius, we'll return 25. Otherwise, we'll return 75. And now back in my main.py, I'm just going to import these. Get stock price and get weather. So now these two functions are available, and when GPT calls these functions, we can run them in the code, get the outputs, and then use that data. So when we make a call to the model, we're going to get this response in return. And what this is a chat completion object. So if we look at the structure here, we can go to choices, choice, and then to messages. And this is where all the information is that we're going to need. So within messages, we can see content. And this is just a reply to whatever prompt we sent the model. In this case, it's saying I'm a program and a few other things. In this case, the model only replied with text. It did not make a tool call. And we can see that by going down here to tool calls, which equals none in this case. Now, in the event that the model did reply with a tool call, how this would look different is content here we can see is none because it's not providing a text response. It's a tool call. And then in the tool calls here, we have a list. And each item in this list provides information on the tool that the model is calling. So this can be one or more tools. And we can see it gives the function name, which in this case is get stock price. It also gives the arguments, which in this case is the symbol for Microsoft. And it gives the ID of the tool call as well. So this is important because the first thing we're going to need to do once we get a response from the model is figure out if it's just replying with text, in which case we can just output that text, or if it's making a tool call, in which case we have to get this information and actually execute those functions. I'm going to go back over to my VS Code here, and I'm going to create another module called utils.py, which is going to contain some helper functions. So I'm going to write three functions here. One is going to be to get the text content from the model response. One to check if the model called tools. And then the third one is to get the list of tool calls from the model response. So this will just be, we'll call this get content. It will take the response as an input. And then it's just going to return the content. So how do we do that? It's just response dot choices zero index dot messages dot content. And we can go back again to this chat completion object to see we're just accessing choices. The first item in the choices list, message, and then content. And that's where we'll get our text. And this is actually message. And then on second thought here, we're actually only going to need one other helper function. So this will be define get tool calls. It'll also take the response as an input, and then it will return the response dot choices 0 dot message dot tool calls. And I can use this to both check if the model made tool calls and as well get the list of tool calls. Then I'll go back to main.py. I'll just import these from utils import get content and get tool calls. Okay, so now we're actually going to start to create the conversation here. I'll write another function called run conversation. And the first thing we're going to want to do is get the user's input. So user input equals input. We can just say ask the chatbot a question. And once we have a question from the user, then we actually have to send that to the chatbot. So how do we do that? Let's go back to the playground here and take a look at what the code looks like when we actually submit something to the model. So if we go into messages here, we can see that this is the format that the model wants to get the input in. So it's a dictionary with role is user, content, which is a list, contains a dictionary, type text, and then a text key here, which has the user input that we're sending to the model. So I'm just going to copy this. And to make our lives easy, I'm going to go back to the utils module and just create another function here. Format user input. It will take as the input, the user input, which is just text. And then I'll just paste this dictionary in and replace the message here with the user input. We can return that. And this will just make things easier for us. So once we have the user input, we have to append that to the messages. So just messages.append and format user input, and then the user input. And I also have to import this function. And now we can send the user message to the model, which we will do just by calling our GPT endpoint function, which takes messages and tools. Okay. There's one or two types of responses that we're going to get from the model here. Either the model is going to call functions, or it's not going to call any functions, and it's just going to provide us with text. So we can figure out if the model is calling functions by getting the tool call list from the response. And to do that, we'll use our get tool call function. If no functions were called, then tool calls will just be none. If functions were called, then they will be in a list. So we'll just say if tool calls, deal with tool calls, and then else, which means no tools were called, it's just a text response. Then we can just print out that response. We'll call this model response text, and we can use the get content helper function for that response. And then we can print this out. And then we're going to have to append this model response to the conversation as well. And the structure is going to actually be exactly the same as what we created here for format user input. The only difference is going to be with role, it's going to be assistant instead of user. So rather than create a whole new function, why don't I just modify this one? I'll call this format message and just make a few changes. So the input will be the text message, and then also just say message type, which will be either user or assistant. So that should work now. I'll save this. I will have to change this from format user input to just format message. Actually, I will re-import this format message, and then I will add the user type. So that works. And then I can just do the exact same thing down here. Messages.append, format message, model response text, and then assistant. Okay, so this deals with the situation when the model doesn't call a tool, but what about when it does call a tool? What happens then? So what we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to get the tool calls, execute the functions, and get the outputs, append all the data to the conversation, then send another call with the new data to the model. So let's go back to the playground here and just run a simulation to see what it looks like and what we need to do to set this up. So I have my functions here already set up, and I'll just ask the question again, what is the sum of the stock prices of Microsoft and NVIDIA minus the temperature in Berlin? Yeah, that's good enough. Okay, so I'll run this. And we can see that we get these three functions that have been called. Get stock price has been called twice, once for Microsoft, once for NVIDIA, and then get weather has been called for Germany. But we can also see that there's this little area here that says submit output for each of these function calls. And what this is this is a way to simulate the function actually providing the information needed, right? So for get stock price, Microsoft, I can put in, say, 420, maybe 120 for NVIDIA, and for get weather, maybe I'll put 25. And I'm going to run this, and that simulates us actually providing the model with this data, right? So then if I were to run this down here, we can see the model provides a response, giving the stock prices, the temperature, making the calculation, and then giving us the result. So what does this look like in the code here? All right, so we're here in messages. We can see that role user, so this was my original question, what is the sum of the stock prices? But what do we get returned here? So the first thing I see here is a dictionary, and we have role equals assistant, then we have content, and there's no content in the text. And then we have another key here, tool calls, which is a list. And this is all the tools that were called by the model, right? So this needs to be appended to the messages, and it has the tool call ID, type, then the function, the name, and the arguments. And then down here, there's another dictionary, and this is role tool, and the content is a list, type text, and the text is 420. So this is the data that would basically come back from the function. So the model would call the function, we would run the function, get that data, and then we would send it back to the model. And this is the way we would do that, by appending another dictionary object with the data for each of the tool calls. So we can see there's one here, there's the one here for the weather, 25 degrees. And then we got a response from the model, from the assistant, and then that's also appended to the message. So there's really 4 dictionary objects here that we have to append. All right, so why don't we just start with the first one here, and these are the tool calls. Just gonna copy this, and I'm gonna go back into my utils module here. I'm just gonna paste this so I can get a good look at it. So essentially, when we get a response from the model that includes tool calls, we have to recreate this object with the appropriate data. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's put this into a function. We'll just call this tool call message, and it's going to take as input the tool calls. So you remember, this is the list that is created. We're going to get this from the model's original response. And then we'll just call this tool message. We'll fix this up. Okay, so we know that the role is going to be assistant, the content, this is going to be the same. What we need to do is we need to figure out how to get the tool call information for each tool into here. So I'm going to take one of these as a sample, copy it, and then I'm going to create another function here, and we'll just call this get tool data. It will take a tool object, and I'm just going to paste this here. Great. So we're going to need from the tool, we're going to need the tool ID. We already know that this is going to be a function, and then we're going to need the name of the function and the argument. So going back to the response that we get from the model, the tool call list is going to have objects that look like this. It's going to be the chat, completion, message, tool call that will have the ID. And then inside function, it will have the arguments and the name of the function. So this tool here that we're using as input for the get tool data, it's going to be one of these chat, completion, message, tool call objects. So what we can do here is just start replacing some of this data. So this should work, tool.id. Type is going to equal function. Then we're going to have the function here, so name. So we should be able to go tool.function.name. And then for arguments, this looks like it's a string. So we'll just say tool.function.arguments. So that should work. And then here for the tool calls, well, we're actually going to create a list. We'll just call it tools, and we'll use a list comprehension, and we'll just say tool for tool in tool calls. And then we'll use this get tool data function here. And then we can replace all of these tools with that list. And then we're going to return the tool message. Okay, so I'll go back to main. I'll import this tool call message. And then I'll actually start off by just appending that to the messages. .append tool call message, and then I'll put in our tool calls. Okay, so next we want to execute these functions and we want to get the outputs. So going back here, if I have one of these objects, which we'll just call a tool, what I need to execute this function is I need the function's name and I need the function's arguments. So let's go back to main.py and I'm going to create another function called execute function call. And it's going to take a tool, which is that object that we just looked at. And the two things I'm going to need again are the function name, which I can get from tool.function.name, and the function arguments, which I can get from tool.function.arguments. Now, this function name that I get here is just going to be a string. So I actually want to be able to take that string and call the function. For that, I'm going to create a tools map, which will be a dictionary. And I know that I have the get stock price function, which I'll use to call get stock price. And I have the get weather function, which I'll use to call get weather. Now I'm also going to want to convert these function arguments to a Python dictionary. So to do that, I'm going to use json.loads and I will import the JSON library. Then I can say function equals tools map, and then I'll put in the function name so that I can actually get the function from here, the real function. And then I can just return function and then function arguments. And this should work. Execute function call. Now let's go back here to see what the data is going to look like again. So I'm going to copy this and then I'm going to create another helper function called tool output message. This is going to take the tool ID and the output message. And then I'll just have to make a couple of changes here. So this is where the output is going to be, and then this is where the tool ID. And then we can return the output message. Now I'll import this and we can go back down to our conversation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run a loop for tool in tool calls, tool output equals tool output message. And then that takes, of course, the tool ID. So tool.id, and then the output, which I can get from this function, execute function call. Then I'm going to append that to the message append tool output. And then I just have to make another request with the revised messages to GPT. I'll get the response. I will append this response to messages, and I will use my format message function. And then I'll print the message out. And then to do that, I'm just going to use an F string, my get content function, and then response after tool call, which is the response I'm getting from the model. Okay, and then one more thing is I also just need to wrap this in a while loop, and that way I can continue a conversation with the chatbot. Great, okay, so we should be good to go and actually test this out. I'll just go to my terminal, Python main.py, ask the chatbot a question. I'll ask, what is the stock price of Microsoft? And I'm getting an error. So let's see what this error looks like. So my output message that I'm appending to the messages list here, it has tool calls, but then none. So it's not actually adding the tool. So I'm going to go back to my utils function here and just take a look. So that should be this message here. And I'm using the get tool data function. And okay, so right away, as I can see, I'm not actually returning the tool object. So that makes sense. It's just returning none. So that should work. Go back to my terminal again, python.main. What is the stock price of Microsoft? And I'm getting another error here. And this error is expected a string, but got an integer instead. So what this is this has to do with my execute function call. So I'm executing this function call, I'm returning the output, but this output that I'm returning is an integer, and the model doesn't want an integer, the model wants a string. So all I have to do here is just, or maybe even right here, I'll just return this as a string and save it again. I actually found one other error that I need to correct first. And this is in this section here. So this is if we call tools, we execute the functions, we get that data, and then we resubmit all of that information to the model for the final response. The first thing I need to do is I need to append that response to the messages list. But I need to append just the text of the response. And here I'm appending the entire object. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say final text response. And then I'm going to use the get content function that I created, which extracts the text from the response of the model. And then I can use this final text response to append to the messages and then also to print out. So we can save this. I'm going to open up a new terminal, and now we should be able to test this out. Python main.py. I'll start just by asking what is the stock price of, why don't we say Amazon? And we can see here it called the tool, and it's giving us the information, $60, which is the price that we have in our function. Now I can just ask something simple like, how are you today? We can see that no tools were called. It replies. And now I'll ask a more complicated question like, what is the sum of the stock prices of Microsoft and Amazon minus the temperature in Paris? And there's our response. So we can see here it called 3 tools, get stock price twice, get weather. I got the information from those tools, it made the calculation, and then it provided us with the results. So this certainly seems to work. Excellent. So if I go back to my tools module, and these are the functions that I created, get stock price and get weather. So again, these are just test functions. They don't actually do anything interesting yet. We're just using them for testing purposes. But what I really want, what I'm really hoping people can see is the power of this, because we can create functions that would essentially do anything. Functions that can get real-time information, accessing APIs, accessing databases, or even functions that can take actions in the world like posting information, sending messages, or activating and communicating with other applications. It's really only limited by our imaginations. So this is very powerful, and right now it's not doing anything interesting because these functions aren't really extending outside into the external environment. But that's what we're going to do next, is we're going to create a chatbot application that can actually go out and get real-time data and do something with it. So we've run out of time for this video, but I'm going to do this in the next video. I'm going to create an application that can access real-time financial and stock price data for a public company and provide financial analysis and investment guidance with that information. If you enjoyed this content, then don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe to the channel. I'll be coming out with lots more videos in the future. Also, if you have any questions or if you have an idea for a topic that you want me to cover, let me know in the comments section. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.